about project schedule management. We're going to go on for about 45 to 50 minutes. There's going to be a few polls as we are going along so we can make sure that you can answer the questions and make it as interactive as we possibly can. One of the things that I would like to mention today is that project scheduling is a science of its own. So we are literally going to, go quickly over some of the basic stuff, but definitely it's something that we usually, go over in training or some that kind of information in about a week. So you're not going to become a schedule expert in 45 minutes, but hopefully this will give you a lot of information, where to find the information to make sure that you know what's up and coming and what is the latest information and where you can find this. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me yet, I am Gabrielle Haskins. I am the CEO of the PMI MCAC and of Project Executive. I do a lot of training for basically for the Frankfurt School of Training and Management, and did that previously with George Washington University. Okay, so one of the things that's really kind of interesting about time is even though we have to manage very closely, time has the least amount of flexibility. If you think about the triple constraint or the constraint that we have in project management, which is scope, schedule, and cost, time is the only commodity that is actually unflexible. We cannot change it, we cannot go back, and there is no way we can change the time frame that we are in, as far as we know for now. So it's really interesting because we always figure out that we have a lot of time to do whatever we want. But you know what? No matter what, the time will go. Today is gone and it will not come back. Sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes not necessarily. One of the things that I want to go back to, for those of you who just joined, we have been going through this, every one of the knowledge area. So I want to just briefly go over the fact that we have core and we have supporting processes in our project management. We already saw integration, we saw the scope, and today we're going to do the schedule, and we are going to do cost next week, and so on and so forth. But this is also to give you the supporting processes. And why do we call them core processes? Basically, because if you don't have a scope and you don't have a schedule, nor did you have a budget, it's going to be really hard to do a project. Everything else is dependent on the fact that you do resource management, and then you do communication management and risk and procurement. They're all supporting the basic core processes that you have to take care of, which is the scope, the schedule, and the cost, as well as the quality, which is the results of the three previous ones. We also have competing constraint, because scope is what we saw last week, is basically what is it that we're going to do? Where does it start? Where does it end? What are the boundaries, the assumptions, and the constraint that we have to live with for the realization of this project? But we also have to think about the schedule. Well, like everything else, we also talked about needs and wants and requirements. And a lot of those things will have competing constraint, because maybe we want to have more specifics. We would like to have this little wants that we absolutely think is indispensable, but it will require more time to do it. And of course, it could be also more expensive. So those are the kind of things that we are talking about when we say competing constraint. It used to be called the triple constraint. It used to be called the iron triangle. All kinds of people give it all kinds of names. The official PMI term now is competing constraint, which means, yes, every time you move any of those, if you change the scope, you're going to have to either adjust the schedule and the cost. And when you do the requirements analysis, you also figure out those are the things that you absolutely need, and the wants need to have a cost assigned to it, because we have limited resources, which includes the money and the people that are available and capable of doing what we need to do. So as you know, as project managers, we always have to do those three balancing act all the time, including the one that comes from the stakeholders, because the stakeholders are going to require different things they want. And we as project managers and with the team have to make sure we can balance all of this in one thing. So that's why those three components that we're talking about, the scope, the schedule, and the cost, are really the core processes of any projects. And that's what we're going to look at today is the scheduling part. Project schedule management. How do we do that? Well, I started to introduce you to all of the standards that we have. And a lot of them are available. I'm not sure even if you're a PMI member that you know where they are, but there's one that just came out in 2019, which is a practice standard of scheduling, and it's the 3rd edition. So this is also really interesting information about how do we do scheduling. A lot of us have to do this. We sometimes have BAs who have assigned that position, but this practice is really all the details and information that you could ever need, wanted, or need to know to do your job. It's really well done. And I'm just going to do a little polling. I'm not sure if people even know. I know it's part of your membership, but if you don't mind just filling this up, let me know if you use any of those standards. And if you're familiar with it, then that's good. If you know, then I can also, all the information is going to be at the end of the slides. The last slides will show you all the places where you can go to, but this is also important for us to know. It's there, it's available, it's free for you as a member, but I'm not sure how many people even know that they exist. So that's why I'm sharing this with you guys today. So most people know how, so about half of you know how to access the standard and estimating. That's good. So I would say most people don't necessarily use the standard. You know how to access them. We know about the PMBOK, but not a lot of people know about this. So just if you want to know, the best way for you to reach this is to go to your PMI.org, access with your ID and member password, and those are free. You just go into Practice and Standards, and you can download it for free, and then you can see how that is. You can also buy it if you want to, but you can also have the electronic version, which works really well if you need to have anything. We also at the chapter have some copies that we have a copy of every one of those standards in paper copy, just in case whenever we can get out and share this information, guys can look at it. So what does project schedule management look like? And for those of you who have been certified maybe a few years back, this is one of the area in version 6 that has changed significantly. So the first thing we do is we plan the schedule management, which means what are the policy, the procedures, the documentation, how do we do schedule management in our environment? And again, it goes back to the organizational process asset that you have and your environment and environmental enterprise factors. The state of Michigan, for example, does things in a certain way. Dart containers will do some things in a different way. And insurance industry might do that project schedule in a different way also. So it's important for you as a PM to know, how do we do schedule management? What are the important configurations and documentation that I need to know? And how do I control the schedules? What are the tools that I use to control my schedules? We also have to define activities. So basically, we started, and we're going to look into that in a few seconds, with the WBS that we did last week. So once you get that, you have your work package. And out of that work package, you're going to have to define this different activity. What is an activity? How do we document the specific action to be performed so that we have a project deliverables? Remember, the work package is a contain, if you want, activity with a time frame, with a cost, and the assigned resources. So that's what we mean by that. What does it mean by defining activities? Once we have the activities that we think we need to create that deliverables, we also have to sequence those activities, which means what is the relationship among those activities? Which one can we do together? Which one can we do, before? Which one has to be done before? Which one can we do in parallel? And so on and so forth. A lot of times we kind of bundled up all of this together. That's why when we mentioned the scope last week, we said, the WBS is not a Gantt chart. In this week information, yes, this is where the Gantt chart lives. This is where you have to develop the Gantt chart. But the Gantt chart, for those of you who ever had to use one, try to do a network diagram with a Gantt chart is a little bit of a nightmare. If you ever find magic formula to do it, please send it to me. It is really hard. It's very convoluted, and it's really, really hard. It wasn't designed to do that easily, but it's an important step. You need to sequence the activities, because this is also where you are going to finally establish the time frame that's realistic for that project. Once we do this, that's where we're also going to develop something like the critical path and all the different paths that we have to, and what do we have there. Also, we're going to talk about float. We're going to talk about all the different activities and why do we care doing this activity. It's because we need to know what's critical. Where do we have some slacks or some float? So where do I have some margin to play with? And we also have to know what are the resources, for example, that are absolutely necessary to do the work, and does that create another issue or a bottleneck on my schedule. And then comes the fun part of estimating the activity's duration. We need to know, now that we have the time frame, what are the work periods needed to complete those activities. And of course, this is going to be done in parallel and in interrelationship with the types of resources. We're talking about skill set here. We're talking, I need a developer, I need a project manager, I need an architect. What kind of types and skill set do I need to do those activities? And again, how much time would they need? And we're going to talk about the different types of time. Effort time is usually what we talk about here. How much time is required to create that effort so that we have a deliverable? So it's not necessarily calendar time. As we know, I might need 3 hours, but in order for me to get the 3 hours for that resources, it might take a little bit more time than just a couple of hours. Once we have all those fun things, we are going to develop the schedule. So this is really putting all those activities, sequencing, duration, the resource requirements, and the constraint. Because of course, this project has to be delivered by a certain time. Milestone is going to have to be in there. Details of each activity is going to be defined so that we know exactly how is that going to look like when I put that schedule into place. And then we also have part of developing the schedule to develop a baseline so we can control it. And the last portion that we have to do is monitor and control the project update and the schedule to make sure that we are as close as possible to that baseline. So project schedule management is really, really very important. Most of us have to deal with that every day. And again, it's very interactive. There's a lot of things that overlaps. It's not just one time we can do all this. It requires the entire team, lots of subject matter expert, but it is a very complex part of the project. What we're going to try to do today is basically try to go over what are those things that we need to do. Basically plan. We have to plan the schedule management. We're going to define the activities. We're going to have to sequence those activities. We're going to show you some tools and techniques to estimate the activity durations. And after we've done all this, we have a schedule. And then we have to figure out, again, based on our environment and the tools and the different components that we have, how do we control that schedule? Because that's also the important part. When we execute it, things will happen, right? People will come in, and how do we know that we're still on track? Then we need the baseline, and we need to be able to control those activities. Some of the overview of what we have to do in scheduling. Part of it is the scheduling methods. Do we have a specific scheduling methods? Do we use specific tools? Do we use project management, software activities or different process and different tools? I know, for example, the state of Michigan, they have the suite, and then they used to use Clarity, and they used to use different types of tools. So your company could be using many different tools to do the same thing. You can always refer back to, Excel and MS Project. Those are the basic tools that most of us have heard used or tried to at a certain point in time. And again, your project information, how is that coming to you? Do we create a real WBS, or do we all start everything through a Gantt chart? How do we compare? How do we know dependencies? Do we even do this? Or if we just put this into a Gantt chart and try to figure out how this is going to work out. For those of you who have been doing this, managing dependency, for example, MS Project and any of the other project management tool is a little bit of a task. They don't seem to be quite perfect in that aspect. But again, always starts where your activity list. And then you can have any kinds of examples of bar charts, network diagram, all kinds of things. If you do this with project, for example, you're probably going to have a 20-page network diagram. I like to do sticky and paper and try to find a room where we can put this on a whiteboard. You can do this electronically also on a whiteboard. And there's a different series of tools that I use from IBM that does process management extremely well. Another thing that we have to go through is the project schedule model development. How do we do scheduling methodology and tools that we use for our specific environment? We also talk about release and iteration length. How do we do this? Do we have time box release? Do we have waves of iteration? Are we using agile or adaptive, iterative, whatever name we want to call it in those time things? What are the time box that we put into our process so that it would make sense? Remember, the work package is 2 weeks. So is the agile iteration. So which one are we picking? Are we going to use the agile process, for example, for specific work packages? Are we going to use it for the entire project? That is really important at this point in time to determine. And if you use different methodology for different part of your process in your project, that's also where the fun starts, because you're going to have to say, I'm doing 2 weeks here, and I'm going to be 4 weeks on the other side of that project. For those of you who manage large integration project, it is challenging. We also want to know, what is the level of accuracy? So what's an acceptable range in your activity duration? Do we want to be as close as possible? Remember, I used to have this joke when I used to teach software development. If you ask any developer how much time it takes to develop anything, for some reason, the people that I work with always told me that they can do the entire world in 3 days. It always took 3 days. Well, I also learned over time that 3 days sometimes went everywhere between 6 days to 6 weeks because that resource was not available. So what is my level of accuracy? How do I want to manage that? Do I work with 50% accurate is fine for me? Or do I need to know, well, we're almost there. We're going to make it. That's something that I want to do. Or do I want to put a number in those activities so I know what duration looks like for that specific activity? My unit of measure is also really important. My staff hours, the staff days, what's in number of hours in one day. In the US, we usually basically have 8 hours paid for, 40 hours a week. It's very different in every other country in the world. They don't necessarily have the same things. The weekdays could be different. We usually work Monday to Friday. Some people work Monday to Saturday and they get Thursday off. Everything in there is important. It's important for you to know what's a weekday, how is the time measured, what are everything else that you're going to measure in those portion of the project. For a construction project, you're going to have to go into everything from cubic yards to, kilometers and so on and so forth. So those are really important to do, and this is where you do it in your schedule management. What is your procedure links? How do we go from the WBS to the framework for the schedule management? And again, is it consistent? Do we have specific tools for specific types of project? My model maintenance, do we also keep track of this? Is this working for me or not? Is there a change? And that usually would come from your PMO. And then again, my control threshold. How do I monitor my schedule performance? Is it just I'm trying to be as close as possible to the time frame? A lot of people control the schedule just by the time frame. It's supposed to be delivered on that date, and whatever is delivered on that date is 100% of my deliverable. Are you using earned value? When I was working for CMS, we used earned value because they were CMM level 5. All projects used EVM rules in order to manage all projects and every activity. But we also had the infrastructure and the process to make that work. Is that something that's feasible in your environment? Because that will give you the amount of work performed compared to the amount of work that was planned and what you actually get out of that. We're not going to go into all these details today because that's a one-day training just by itself. But just know that this is where you need to know what are the rules of performance and how do you measure that? Because you'll create a baseline. You still need to know how do you manage that baseline. And the effort and the progress as you go along in executing. You also need to know what is your reporting format. What is my, and just for going back to the little information just before that, my schedule variance and my performance variance can also be done with trend analysis and different types of tools if you don't want to go through the full EVM. But you definitely need a baseline. If you don't have a baseline, it's pretty much impossible. So if you're using MS Project or any kind of tools, the one thing that's really important is that, yes, you have to press that little button that says, yes, I want to have a baseline, because no baseline you can control. You don't know where you're at. But it might look better, but you don't necessarily know where you are at. And the format and the frequency, again, for your schedule reporting is really important. Do we want to have, again, what kind of progress report? And what are we reporting when you report on the schedule? Are you reporting actual work performed compared to the time frame that you spend, or the cost and the money that was spent? Or we're just doing a trend analysis on the number of deliverables that were produced for whatever time frame we have in there. Lots of information that we have into this today. We used the bicycle example last week, and I want to bring back this picture because when we talk about the work package, we would talk for something like this in that specific example. Yours could be totally different, but that's what we're talking about. So every one of those little packages should have a series of activities. We should also know the time frame that's required, so the effort to realize those activities, and what is the deliverable that's going to come out of all those work packages. So those are really important. And why do we care about that? Because the work package is the work defined at the lowest level, and also where the cost, duration, and it can be estimated and managed. So basically, when you are controlling the performance of your schedule, you're actually controlling the performance of each and every one of your work package. I hope that kind of makes sense. We try to manage the entire schedule and all the deliverables at the same time, but in theory, if you look at the real concept of project management, we are supposed to manage the work package. That's why, in a certain way, when you look at Agile or looking at this in the lean methods or something that's going to shrink those basic scope in smaller, more manageable components, it makes sense because you want to manage something that is manageable. So in each work package, you have a time frame, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever is the standard that you chose. And then you also have the activities, and then you would define the resources that would make it possible for you to do that in that specific time frame. So that's why the work package and the scope is really important, and that's why we carry it over. Now, the fun part is I get my work package. I know what the work package is supposed to be. I have to define the activities. So what is an activity? Well, it is, again, related to the work package. And we also need to find what is the logical or sometimes physical relationship between those activities. Do I put the back wheels of the bicycle, for example, before or after, or it doesn't matter? Can I do the two wheels separately? And that kind of thing. So those are really, really important. In my activity definition, I really have to have a list of all my activities in the schedule. Each and every one of them should have an identifier. So since it's a work package, it would be related to the work package numbering in your WBS. And the scope of work for each one of them should be defined. I'm creating the back wheel of the bicycle, or I'm creating something else. The activity attributes, that's also important. We did the WBS dictionary to kind of explain some of the definition or the terms that we need to clarify for everybody. Could be very clear for me, might not be necessarily clear for everybody in the project. Activity attributes are the same thing. All the info related to the activity, and this is progressive. Think of this as your activity dictionary if you want, because you need to know, maybe I'm going to go this and clarify as I go, what does it mean to do X, Y, Z? Important thing about the activity definition also is a milestone list. What are my major checkpoints? Remember that as far as time is concerned, milestone has a time frame of 0. There is no time allocated for a milestone. It's not that I have to deliver anything. It's just a point in time when something needs to happen. and it usually doesn't require anything. It's just, I have to deliver that project or report, or, this is where we need to check to make sure that we have enough money to go further. This is, all kinds of other things could happen, but the milestone itself has a time frame of 0. And then we also have the request to change. So when we do activities definition, we also need to know, how is the change that we define in integration, how does it look like? If we change the scope, is that going to change any of those activities? And the requested change are going to go to what activities and what work package. So lots of details for this one. How do we define the activities and some of the tools and techniques? Well, you're going to need a lot of expert judgment. This is really subject matter expertise. You need to know, how much time does it take? Whoever is going to deliver the work package, are you subject matter expert? Developers, architects, people who are doing the work physically, people who are specialized on the product or the service, are the people who are going to tell you, it takes about this time to do this activity. And this is what this activity looks like. This is what we have to do to make this happen. And again, the composition, and this could be to what they call rolling wave or agile. It could be iterative, and it could be progressive, because sometimes we don't necessarily know how all of this is going to happen. And as we all know, in order to define this appropriately, lots of meetings with your stakeholders, going back to the requirements definition, the needs and the wants. So this is really, when we talked about it last week, and we're going to talk about it today and next week again, the 3 core processes are always very interactive. It's like you set up the basic scope, and then you work back and forth all the time about the resource and the activities, and define the activities, and then go back until you get all of this defined to the point that you can move forward with the plan. The activity characteristic is also, how do we know that the status or the completion is measurable? What's 50% acceptable? What's I'm almost there? What does that mean? Do we want to have this as accurate as possible? So that's why I put those information before that. It's really important to know, how do we measure this? How do we know? Is it important for us? What levels of accuracy do we want or do we don't want? And then it can be reported easily at any time, because again, the project process has to be clear to the project manager, to the team, and to the stakeholders. So it has to be clear, hopefully, for everyone. And it has to start and end. Events are clearly defined, and they can be easily communicated. Where do we start? Where do we end? How do we know that's good enough? How do we know that this is what we are accepting at this point? And each activity also has a single deliverable. We know that 1 point through whatever is going to give me this. And I could trace it back, because it has to be traced back to your requirements again and your scope. And time and cost can be easily estimated. This is really the art and science of project management. This is when and that's why there's a whole series of standards that just goes into estimating and scheduling, because this is really a lot of work. This is where everything has to be detailed to the point that you know exactly what it is, how much time it takes, what does it look like, and how much it costs to do each and every one of them. So the other thing that we also need to know is we have to define the time frame. And we also have the resource calendar input. So what is a time frame for the resource? For both materials and humans, which one are available? We have to describe each and every one of them. We also have to outline the work days, the number of business hours, the shift hour works, and holidays and work days like weekends. All of those are very specific usually to our environment, and they have to be specified so that we know that we have a certain amount of days, and those are the days that we're going to be working, and this is how many hours it's going to be, and if there's overtime or whatever specifics on that outline, it has to be described. We also have to examine the quantity and the capability and the availability of the equipment and the material resources. So not only is it necessary to know how much, but we also need to know what are we capable of and what is available. And that's true for software development. It's also true, I do a lot of projects for people who do manufacturing. And one of the main issue is most of the time we try to sell out capacity and then to realize that we either do not have the availability or the capability inside to produce what they are asking for. So those are really two important things. Yes, we would like to be able to do more. Can we do it? Do we have the available equipment and resources, both physical and human resources, to make that possible? So those are really, really important stuff to make sure we have that. Now, when we do the project schedule management, including the agile components, how do we do that? We already know that the work package is about 2 weeks. So you can decide to use some of those work packages and use that agile approach. But you have to create your schedule that represents when the deliverables for the project will be completed. So you're going to do this for 2 weeks. How many sprints are you going to use? How many sprint is going to be necessary to do whatever that part of the component is? Are we going to do the entire project plan, or just certain portion of your WBS is going to use that agile methodology? So that's why it was important to think about that in integration and to specify in your scope that this is a type of life cycle that you want. And the methods are going to be the same. You're going to have to do your critical path. So if you want to do agile, you have to make sure that you have the capacity and the capability of doing that method for that specific area on your project. Are you going to do it on demand? Are you going to use Kanban kind of approach, which is basically a supply chain approach to doing the deliverables? Those are really important for you to know. And this is where you have to put the time frame in and say, yes, this is the portion of the WBS in the project that we're going to do. And those are my sprint. They're going to be 2 weeks or 1 week, whatever that is. And they're going to go on for that period of time. And we're going to do all those deliverables using that time frame. We also need to know in the agile roles and responsibility, when we talk about resources and scheduling, we're talking about roles. We're talking about skill set. We're not talking about individuals that we know. We're talking about cross-functional team members, product owner, or team facilitators. For the agile portion, those are going to be the roles and responsibilities that have to be also part of your scope. When you define that work package, one of those roles is going to have to be in there, and then you need to know what their role is going to be, what the deliverables are going to be responsible for, and eventually what we're going to look at next week is how much the cost is related to those resources. So those are really important, roles and responsibility for the different roles. The other thing that we need to do is activity sequencing. We need to identify and document the logical relationship that we call dependency. Some of them are mandatory. They have to be done that way. You cannot do, for example, you cannot, put the house foundation in before you put the foundation in the cement down. That doesn't work the other way. Discretionary is something you can do it one way or the other. You can decide. Something is also external. If you're trying to pour cement and it's pouring down rain, it's going to be hard to do. You can't do that. So it's an external dependency, which is the weather, for which we usually have very little or no control over. Now we also have to do a schedule network analysis. Once you do all this dependency, we have to create those little networks. And in real life, I, again, do this with a little sticky. Which one needs to go first? Where do we begin? Where do we end? Which one of those have a logical relationship, and how does that look like? So we can physically see where it is and where there's maybe disagreement. People say, no, I need to do this one. It doesn't go there. It has to go before, this one or something like that. So this is really important for us to talk about that. Lots of sequencing tools, and we're just going to briefly go over some of them. Precedence diagram, of course, is one of the most common. Activity on arrow diagram, activity on node, and the most common that we know all about is the critical path. So this is a precedence diagram, just to show you. We're just basically trying to say which comes first, based again on your list of activities. This is where we start, all your activities. So those little boxes would represent each and one of your activity. And of course, you have to do this with your team. Everybody has to decide, yes, do we do A and then B and C and so on and so forth? This is what you call your basic precedence diagram. So the activity on our diagram is a little bit more sophisticated. It can show you activities that here are related. They're not necessarily logical, but it will be easier if you do one, and then eventually 5 needs to be kind of done before 1, or when at least 1 is done, 5 can move forward, as well as 7. So this is to show other types of relationship that might not be directly linear to the previous one. There's 4 logical relationship. I'm sure that most of you are finished to start, finish to finish. So I need to finish A before I can start this one. A and B has to be finished before those two. Those two need to start at the same time. And then this one needs to start before we can finish the other one. So all those relationships, like I said, this is a 1-week training that we're trying to do in 45 minutes. So we can always go back to this one, but just know that there's a lot of relationship, and all of those are important for you to know when you put your activities in a network diagram. The other thing that we also need to know is the slippage analysis. So leads, what is an activity that will accelerate the successor task? And then which one would be delayed if the other one, it doesn't start? So those are all kinds of activities, again, when you say, okay, how much time do I need to do this? And this one has to wait a certain amount of time before I can even start the other one. Or when I put this one in, it's going to create a delay for the following task. All of those, again, are really important for you to know. And like I said, it's all very well explained in the PMBOK. It's very well explained in the scheduling. That's about all we can do for today, but you should know that. Critical path method, why do we care about that? Well, because we have, at this point, we should have all the different paths. All of them should be from start to finish. We also find every possible way to get from beginning to end, and we should have activities determined for duration for each and every one of them. What we want to do is we want to find the longest path, because this is going to be the one that's critical. Once you find those paths and you find the one that's the longest one, this is really the time frame that's required to do that project. If you don't do those tasks, the project is not going to happen. Then you have to start the earliest possible time to start and the earliest possible time to finish, and the latest time to start and the latest time to finish. And we're going to look at all those information briefly again, because what you want to do is you want to see, okay, this is my longest path. All the other paths also need to be done, but I should have a little bit of slack or flow somewhere so I know I can move things around if I needed to. So that's where we do the forward and backward paths. And this is what the critical path looks like, right? You have a start, all your activities, early start, early finish, activity duration for each one of them. And you're going to find out from the start to finish what is your longest possible path for this one here. And then you're going to see that the one that are in gray are the non-critical one. Why is this one critical? Because this is the longest path. The other thing that's on a critical path, there is no flow. There is no change. If you change anything in the critical path, it is going to change the time frame of your project altogether. And why do we care to do all of this? Well, because if we know that I have a little bit of slack somewhere, I can also have a little bit of leeway to move things around if something ever needed to. So we do the forward pass because we want to find the longest path and the critical path. And we do the backward path because we want to determine the flow on one activity or on the entire project. So this is basically how you do that. You go from beginning to end, and you also calculate the flow from early start to late start to early start and late finish to early finish. That's also going to give you the slacks on the critical path. So again, we're not going to go into more details. For those of you who did your PMP recently, it's probably one of the most difficult. When I teach this PMP certification, this is where most people just get like, I don't want to do this. It's a tough one. But the more you do it, the easier it gets. The other very important standards that I want to talk about today is project estimating. Because now that we have the activities and we know what needs to get done and how they will get done and what sequence we have, we also need to find how do we estimate. And again, that's another very good standard, but it's not necessarily well known unless you're really working for highly sophisticated government agencies. Most people just do this, on the fly. We're guessing it. How do we estimate the activity durations? Well, again, expert judgments. People have done this many, many times. People are subject matter expert. And there's many different methods. We can do analogy, parametrics, 3 points estimate, bottom-up, data analysis, and decision-making. One of the, whoops, sorry, I think I moved it mouse a little bit too fast. And again, what's really important in this one here is which one do you guys use? Do you use one or not? Most people use them, some people don't. It's really kind of, as far as I know, not too many people are using this. I'm not sure how many people really do this. I've learned about this and worked with this in a lot of more sophisticated government agency, but not too many people that I know are using estimating tool. So most of you use this. I will show you some of the most common one, but one of the things that's really interesting about estimate is estimates are usually progressive elaboration. The only time we know exactly how much it's going to cost is when the project is over. Most of the time when we start, it's the ROM or an estimate or a swag, which means you can be anywhere between minus 25% to plus 75%. So you're guessing, actually guessing what you can get to. When you are done with your budget or your schedule, you are probably anywhere between minus 10 to plus 25. And definite is fine between 5 and 10%. This is basically when a project is over, because since every project is unique, you can do it again, and then you could be anywhere between 5 and 10. That's why we have contingency. We're going to look at that next week. What we also should include in our estimate is a variation. Is it 10 weeks plus or 2 weeks or 2 days? That's also an important point for us to know, because nothing ever happens exactly as we are planning or trying to. And then the percent probability is also important. Lots of software applications can do that for you, but what you need to know is the estimate is really progressive, and it has to be, and this one, I'm sorry, it's a rough order of magnitude that we have in there. So coming back, how do we consider estimate? When we started a project, or when they give you a budget on the charter or the scope, this is what we have. It could be, it's very far from reality. It could be the money that we have available to do that project. It could be, whatever we think it's going to cost based on a few projects that we had before. Most of the time, that evaluation is very wide. And it's only by the time you get to the final product or detail that you can figure out if you are close or totally far away, for the schedule and for everything else. Estimating activities, again, working time is also important. Effort is really the hours required to complete the task. That's what everything is comprised of. When we talk about time on the schedule, it has to be effort time compared to working time and elapsed time. But all activities have to be described in effort time. Then you put the elapsed time. So how much time does that require? What does it look like in the calendar? And that comes with the capacity and the capability of the resource and the time that they have available. Productivity is also how much work can we get out of even at the best possible situation. Even in the 8-hour day, the best productivity that we can get is about 80%. So the best productive resources work about 6 hours out of 8. If you work more than 8 hours, for every hours that you work, your productivity would decrease 50%. So working 12 hours a day is not necessarily very productive. Availability. Okay, we know that person is really good, but they're not available. They're working on 3 other projects, and you can only have them 2 hours a week. How long is that going to take? And again, continuous duration. What can be stopped and interrupted? And again, what cannot be stopped? Can we change? Can we stop in a way and then start over again? And those are really important for you to describe and to get the real picture in your scheduling calendar. Estimating life cycle is really important. So we need to prepare for estimating. We need to have some methods, some tools. We have to create those estimates, and we also have to create a baseline for those estimates. You're going to hear that a lot, but because in order for us to know if those estimates are making sense, We have to check over many different projects to see, are we doing a good job at estimating, or are we just like swagging everything we can? And this is something that you can also get into your estimating standard. Really important for you to do that. And that's another one. When you prepare for estimate, you have to have all your inputs, right? We just talked about that. Where do you get this information? From your previous project documents, from your subject matter expert, the techniques that we use, and so on and so forth. And how are the activities? How do we estimate those activities? How do we do all of this to create a project estimation approach that works for all the projects, some of the projects, or is it different? Is it the same for each and every one of them? And how do we get that out? Well, it's going to give us an estimating approach with some kind of information on how to estimate. And then we have to work on the estimating process improvement because, again, this is iterative. Every project is different. So we need to know that, yes, in that kind of project, we are as close as we possibly can, or we're not. So that's how it should be working. Some of the tools that we use, and again, we just saw some of them, one-time estimate, analogous, you have some of those tools that you mentioned that you guys do, regression analysis, learning curve, heuristic, 3-point estimate is the one that we know, and the reserves analysis, we're just gonna do like in the cost estimate. Just to show you an example of what it looks like when you're doing a WBS. Analogous in this case is we compare project A to project B, C, and D that we've done before. Parametrics is like we have components that we can measure. We know deliverables 2.1, for example, is something we've done before. And we can add this and figure out, yeah, when we do this kind of activity, we are pretty good at estimating it, and then we can multiply it or use it as a comparison. And the bottom up is like we have all those work package. We've done this before. We know how much times it takes. Those estimates are pretty reliable. We use that to do anything. So the one thing again is to document this so that the other PM who comes after you or the other project that you're working on, you can remember that, because if you don't write it down, you will forget. Okay, analogous and parametrics, some basic definition. Analogous is really top-down estimating. And again, it's an expert judgment. Parametric, your quantitatively based method. You multiply quantity of work. That's where the work package works, because if you can identify the work package, you know exactly what activities are in there, you can use this to multiply for your next project. Some information about techniques category. Some of them are quantitative. Analogy, parametrics, and bottom-up is pretty much quantitative. You measure the work package, you add them up. Every time you get the same work package, it should be similar. You also have different ones that are relative, like affinity grouping. If you're doing something you've never done before and you put a bunch of subject matter expert into a room, that's going to be an affinity grouping. They will tell you, yeah, you know, in those projects we do this. There's also a new tools that most of us have learned from through Agile and Management 3.0, which is planning poker. Same thing, subject matter expert, talking about different ways of doing this. We're giving a relative estimating category. And qualitative is B, expert judgment. Observation, interviews, surveys for things that we cannot always qualify, like customer survey. Yeah, we can put a 4 or a 5. Is it really exact? No, it's qualitative. So how can we translate that so that it makes sense for us in estimating? And now what we should have at this point is to develop a schedule. And when we develop a schedule, we have to have up here our milestone. Remember, this is a time frame of 0. What needs to be complete? For example, complete component 1 by this time, and 2 here, and so on and so forth. The other one would be a summary of the schedule. Can we put all of this in the work package so that we can show this to your program manager or your PMO? And then again, you have the full details activity. The reason why we develop a schedule after we put all of this together is to establish a baseline so we can control it eventually when we execute and when we control. And this is Gantt territory. This is where the Gantt chart is absolutely necessary. It's one of the great tools. I think it was invented for it, maybe not, but it is very useful to do that. But again, if you have a lot of projects, remember you can also separate your Gantt charts for different components of your project. Because trying to put all of this together sometimes can make a Gantt chart looks like a mammoth, not an elephant. It's a little bit too big to even understand. Some of the scheduling tools that we need to learn. We just saw the critical path, right? We saw a little bit of information that comes from the network diagram. There's many different things that we also do. The resource leveling. We have the schedule. Can we still move on to see how those scheduling tools are going to help me? The PERT that we could use for estimating. There was also the what if Monte Carlo scenario, and schedule compression and crashing. Because what happened when you present your schedule, most of the time you're going to say, it's going to take 18 months. Is there any way that you can do this in 12, right? Most of us have those requests when you work your tail off to get the best schedule, and they come back and say, can we do this in a shorter period of time? Of course, right? This is where you put all those tools together. Resource leveling, this is what it looks like. So you try to do your best to put the activities before you level them, and then eventually you work on the schedule. Microsoft does that very well. Most of the tools that use the Gantt process does that very well. What they do is they reassign your resource. This is when you get your report that says this resource is being overused or underused. Then you can really play with this until you get the best possible way to level the resource so you don't have all the resources coming in at the same time, and it goes through a more standard elaborated time. Then you do the PERT. You can also look at what are the 3 possible ways of estimating this time frame. So you go back to some of the activities, so you can do this with your activities. And when you start with, and you say, what is the optimistic time frame, the most realistic and the pessimistic, and to use the formula, and that works really well, by the way, in Excel. You can do this for all your activities. I usually do it up front. So this way, when I'm being asked to change, I already know where I can go as far as I can go one way or the other. So that's one way of doing it. That's, by the way, this formula was created when they went to the moon. So this is the formula. It also goes with standard deviation. This is what a Monte Carlo looks like. It's probability and all kinds of distribution that tells you this can happen, but it also gives you a range. If you have 80% chances that it's going to happen, and of course a 10% chance that it's not going to happen, and then you can play with this until you find the exact time frame that works. It's a little bit more sophisticated than the average, but it does work. Schedule compression, this is when you have to fast track. Can we move those activities? Can we do this in parallel, a little bit more than we thought so? And crashing. Crashing is usually, you want to do this before you're in executing. Most of the time we do this in executing when you have had a resource and suddenly they give you all the resource, and then you have to figure out a way to make that. Crashing is really going to cost a lot more money because you're adding resources that were not budgeted for into a project that's already in trouble. Fast tracking, there's a risk. You can fast track up to a point where you are going to put in jeopardy the critical path of the project. So those are to be done very carefully. Again, the critical path, all of those fast tracking and crashing has to be done on your critical path. And we also know that it's the longest path, there's 0 float, and everything on this critical path has to be managed very closely. The float, you're going to have the total float, which is on the project, the free float, which is whatever is a little bit of time that you have, and the project float. The more fast tracking and the more crashing you do, you don't have any free float or total float anymore. You're coming to the point where you have no float and no free float. You are basically walking on a rope. If you can make it happen, the next thing you do is the risk assessment to tell you, okay, I can do this, but this is the risk. And they have to sign on it, because if not, you're putting your life on a rope. Agile scheduling, same thing. Just have to make sure that you know where it starts, where it ends, how many iteration plans, and all that kind of stuff. Same kind of process, just a little bit faster, integrate into your work package. Give you the little example of this one here, some basic information. Remember, a sprint is usually basically definition as 2 weeks. Works well with the work package. Release planning, make sure that all of this also goes in the same way. User story decomposes into the backlog item and then starts with a project vision, and then your releases are determined. A Kanban, basically your backlog. As you move them along, you can see where they are completed. Same kind of documentation. It has to be known what is the backlog, what's your activities for each one of them, what is your time frame, what is your sprint in this one here, and what do you consider being complete. That's also really important. What you also want to know in the Kanban is each user story is also like a work component and has to be represented in sticky. So think about this as your work package in the Agile format. That's why I put this one in there. Control schedule for this one here, this is really how do we determine this? How are we going to control the schedule? At this point, you have a baseline, you have a schedule, and how do you do that? Do you do this through the earned value? Do you do burn down chart, performance review, trend analysis, whatever it is that you decided that you were going to do? This is what earned value looks like. And again, this is used to see where you are at some point in time. And then you can also use this to forecast if you need to change anything in the future. And the second portion is, again, your iteration or burn down chart. How much time or cost or resources am I doing for the amount of work and the time frame that I've determined in my process? So as a summary, in the schedule management, we have to plan the schedule management. Units, performance, all that kind of stuff have to be defined upfront. Then we have to define our activities. What's an activity? How do we document each one of them? And what is the deliverables that relates to each one of those activities? Sequencing is really important. This is where you have either some leeways or you don't. That's where you determine the critical path and how you're going to manage all that. And the estimate. Now you have to play with the estimation and the duration for each one of those activities. How much time? Remember, duration is always an effort time. It then has to be put into a calendar and everything else that works with it. And then you develop your schedule because you want to have a baseline, and that's where the Gantt chart lives and happily lives. And then the control. What do we control? How much accuracy do we need or want? And what are the tools that I have in my environment to do that? And this is it. So make sure you also have a look at the requirements management, the estimating standards, and the scheduling standards. Those are really two good, very detailed information about what we talked about today. And I'm sorry it took a little bit more time, but like I said, I was trying to cramp everything else in there for 45 minutes, but it's kind of hard. So I want to thank everybody for participating today. I'm sorry we stretched a little bit more than we were planning on. We took about 10 minutes more, but I'm very happy that you joined with us, and we're going to do another one next week on cost management. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I hope to see you again next week. Enjoy, and thank you so much for participating. We really appreciate it. Bye.